If you are thinking about owning your own business, one of the best ways to become a business owner is to acquire an existing business. There's a lot of arguments for all the different ways, for starting a business from scratch and going out and buying a franchise and starting that from scratch. But when you acquire an existing business, you get the advantages of having people in place, money, cash flow coming into place. And if you're somebody like I was when I went out on my own, you might have kids and car payments and house payments and a spouse that would love to have some extra cash coming in to keep the business and life and home afloat in a proper way. And so we deal with a lot of people from around the world, a lot of corporate refugees, if you're one of those like myself, EA, or enterprising veterans if you're leaving the military. And thank you folks for working with the military and protecting our great country. It sometimes is really helpful to start with your cash flow and the people and everything in place and just take it to the next level. Nonetheless, if you're in that boat, I've got this 11 central points to help you buy a great business, and I think it's really important. Now this screen is going to be really jazzed up, and I realize it's too small to see, but you're going to see different listing information, businesses that are for sale. And if you want, I can send you a direct report at the very end of this. You will have my contact information, or you can just reach out to BuyBizUSA.com, BuyBizUSA.com, and you'll find our contact information. But this is an example of a business that's for sale, right? I made it up. It says Legacy Landscaping. That's not what it is. But it has a lot of different data, and there's some important things for you to just be aware of. And I see this, and I'm reaching out to people because I know that many times it can be very confusing in the marketplace, and just once in a while, we've even seen people who have been, thinking they're getting one thing and they end up with something else, and it's not very satisfying. And it's really important for me to see people when they acquire businesses they're getting for the right price and they know what they're getting into. One of the key things is you would talk about, well, how much does the business earn? How much does it generate if I work in the business? A couple terms that you should get really familiar with are seller's discretionary earnings, or owner benefit, or the net cash flow that's there for somebody that's running the business and working on a day-to-day basis. That's what a person can take out of the business, although a lot of business owners, like myself, try to minimize what we have to pay in taxes, so we write off depreciation, amortization, interest. Maybe we have some opportunity to write off a personal car, or vehicle, or cell phones, or insurance, and maybe money to a spouse or something like that might not work in the business. So it's that optional one, and that's why it's discretionary. And the other one is called EBITDA. And if you're not familiar with either of these terms, you can reach out to us. You can also type in or Google a definition of what these mean, and we can share with you more information. But it's really important to know what we're talking about, because if you look at a tax return for a business and you're trying to determine how much it's making, you might see a puny number, maybe even a negative number, and yet the business could be making six figures and well above. But you just need to know how they work with the different numbers to get to where they are. So this is a heads up on that. Now here's what type of thing. This is just one of the things that we look at, and this is off of one of the listing information that we saw. Do the earnings justify the price, right? So the price is $400,000 here, and this has got one that has seller financing or bank financing for $80,000. The adjusted net, and again, there's that term, another term for seller's discretionary earnings, is $263,000. And so you might think, well, this business is selling for almost 1.5 times earnings. That seems kind of low, because I see a lot that are selling for 2 to 3 and sometimes more than that. But it's important to just take a look at it. The other factor you might look at is, does the seller's discretionary earnings compared to the gross sales make sense? So when you see businesses where, and this is, I haven't done the calculation percentages, but this is probably about 18, 19, 20% of the total sales. In other words, the money that you made, this 263 is close, to about 20% of the gross sales. When people are showing a really high number, suddenly they're making 50% profit and that sort of thing. That could happen in some rare businesses, but many businesses are earning between 10 and 20%. And when they get close to that 20%, I even get a little cautious. These are just red flags. They're the things for you to be aware of, so that you're protecting yourself, saying, well, let me make sure that makes sense. And one way you can work towards confirming that makes sense, you can always hire a great business broker, or hire an accountant, go pay for a database and look at what other people in the same industry are generating, and see if any of these things make sense compared to what other stuff is going on out there. There's no single way to determine the price of the business, and there's a lot of different things that people look at for determining it. But number one is the price reasonable? Okay. A second thing is, and I just mentioned that, do the gross sales make sense compared to the net earnings? And I've seen people that are like showing you go back 3 or 4 or 5 years and they're not making much money percentage-wise, and suddenly the year they want to sell, they're making all this high percentage of money. And I just caution people, it doesn't mean that that isn't possibly true. Maybe the other years they were hiding income, and you've got to figure that out if you want to deal with that. But nonetheless, just be wary and don't be scared, don't be overly nervous, just be aware and do your research out there. So the ratio of gross sales to SCE, and I just mentioned this, and rent can be a big factor. You've got a business and you can control a lot of things like the cost of goods. You can improve the cost of goods and make them manageable. You can control your labor, but things like rent you're sort of stuck with for quite a while. You usually can't negotiate rent. So if the rent is really high compared to everything, then that's kind of a red flag too. Another thing I look at early on is why are they selling? Now they might not tell you everything. They might put other business, other opportunities, CEO, owner, all these different things. But I usually look in there to say, why are they leaving the business? So they're saying retirement. So if you go to meet the person and the guy's 34 years old and he's retiring, unless he's selling it for $1 bazillion, that's a red flag. On the other hand, then maybe the person's in their late 50s, early 60s, 70s. I've had people in their 80s selling businesses with our firm. You think, well, yeah, maybe it's okay that they retire, right? But just make sure you sort of have a good understanding and look beyond what they've just written to see if it makes sense completely. So it's just got to make sense completely to you. Another thing is to look at how long or how many hours the person that's running the business and selling the business is working in the business. So quite often in some of the ads, they'll share, hey, they're working 40 hours, 50 hours, 60 hours. Sometimes they'll say, hey, I'm working 12 or 16 hours, and that's not a whole lot of time. That's okay. But you got to figure out if you're going to take over the business, are you going to be working in the business yourself? Maybe you're going to have a spouse or a family member that's going to work in the business. Are you leaving a job? And if so, do you have the ability, or if not, do you have the ability to run the business the way the current owner is doing that? I had a situation years ago. I was with the oil companies for a while, and I had a gentleman that was running a gas station. And it was a auto repair shop, and he'd been around for forever. Probably had the place for 40 some years, and ran like a clock. He'd go in early in the morning at 7 in the morning, and he'd leave by 12:30. Go play golf a lot of times and hang out with his buddies. And one of the other fellow brokers got real confident, and they borrowed some money from the family, and they went out and they bought this business. And then that broker came in and started walking in at 7 and leaving at 12, and the employees had no respect, and he was missing a lot of stuff. Early on in taking over a business, you might expect or might calculate that you're going to work a little bit longer than normal, or maybe a whole lot longer than normal, to really get your head around the business. But just be aware of what is required and what the existing business owner is doing. Another thing I look at is how long the business has been around, but even more importantly, how long the current owner has owned the business. I was helping a client yesterday from Atlanta moving down here, and we were looking at one business, and we found it'd been around for almost 30 years, but the new owner had only had it for half of a year, 0.5 of a year, and they were all ready to get out. But they were saying, oh, it's great, it's amazing, it turns out to be too far from my house. And I think they would have known how far it was from the house before they bought the business. So it sounded sort of like one of those things we needed to really closely look at and find out why the person is selling the business after a half of a year. It could be a legitimate reason, but again, it's one of those red flags I look at. Okay. Also, people, when they sell a business, should be getting out of the business completely, a non-compete. By the way, the non-compete isn't just for the seller. I'll go back to this slide out there, but it also should be for any key people in the business, and sometimes it can be tricky to get the people selling. I can tell you years ago, when I actually got first into this business, I sold a business to a gentleman from Europe, and he had just bought, prior to that, a really big marketing company that sold like placemats and coasters and mugs and shirts and stuff like that. And he was going to use this business he bought from me to do some of the production. And I went in about 3 or 4 weeks later after he had bought it from the second business from me, and the lights were dark and he was total in depression. Turns out that the business that he bought, the one that was really the moneymaker, the one that was multiple millions of dollars that he took his capital from England and moved to the U.S., The son had left and got wind that the dad was selling the business, and he went around to all the people during this time period that the business was under contract and closing, and signed contracts with all the major, and these were major restaurants, and said, hey, my dad is retiring. I would love to carry on the business. I've worked in the business for the last 5 years. I know the industry, your needs, etc. Would you sign a 5-year contract? I'll give you a really good incentive. And they took all the business away from this poor man that bought the business. That son should have signed the contract. The broker and the law firm should have been up on that and protecting it. And I'm just telling you, be careful, be wary, etc. Another factor you want to look at is what kind of training. You're going to have enough training. And also, are they going to give you non-compete? Okay, is there a special licenses required? And there are a lot of businesses like hair salons and nail salons and that sort of thing. There's a lot of construction-related businesses that have some unique licenses, and you got to figure your way around how you're going to handle that, right? Is the owner going to help you? If it's an SBA, if you're getting an SBA loan, the owner can only be around for up to a year. But there are some banks that are a little bit more generous or lenient on some programs, and we can go into that in more detail. But make sure that you're looking at a business where you're prepared to run the business. Another place I find is finding what the data source is. What I mean by that is, where are we getting this information? I've seen stuff that says, come work in the business for 2 weeks and you'll see that I'm making all this money and then you can buy the business. I've seen that going with some smaller businesses, and I find that totally amazing. One of the first situations I had when I got involved in the industry back in 2004, it was a law firm had come to me just because they were working on a client who had come down and bought a business, and the seller had known he was going to come down and check out this restaurant bar, and had invited tons and tons of people and had them come in for free, but was looking like they were paying $20 cover charge at the door, and it was a total ruse. I like things that where you're looking at tax returns, P&Ls, proven statements, bank deposits, and it's important to do your due diligence, but look at the data sourcing and see if it's in tax returns, that's really great, or P&Ls, etc. All right, so make sure you have a good source of financial records for doing it. In other words, is there reasonable expenses and adjustments to the thing? So I mentioned that you might see a business where you look at the cash flow or the tax returns of the P&L where they're low, making this little bit of money, and yet they're claiming they're making a whole lot of money. You got to look at where they've added back. Are things like depreciation and amortization added back? Well, that's normal because you're not writing a check to Mr. Depreciation or the depreciation company or the amortization company. You might have interest and you might get your own interest, but this is really tied to the personal owner, and so those are often removed. That's where part of the words you get from the term EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. But then there's other things that are going to add back. Maybe they're paying a spouse who's not worked in the business for the last 7 or 8 years, still $50,000 a year, and that would be added back because when you took over the business or take over the business, you probably are not going to pay the owner's spouse $50,000 a year to do nothing, right? So be careful in terms of looking at that. Get some help. Always get a good attorney. Always get a good accountant. Always get a good business intermediary to help you through the process. I highly recommend it. Make sure you can control rent. I meant, the cost. I mentioned rent is usually a fixed cost, and you can't change that. But it shouldn't be high, disproportional to the total operation of the business. And you're going to look up details and stuff like that. But we see like a lot of restaurants as an example. That should be at 10% at the max, ideally maybe 8%. And when they get too high, it just becomes a really tough economic burden on the business that you have a hard time fixing. Do your research. Find out if it's already been pre-qualified for a loan. Now, this doesn't apply to you people who are coming from other countries because you need to have a green card or you need to be a U.S. citizen. You also have to have fairly reasonable credit, 600, 640 or above. That's not overly thing. One of the things you can't have if you are a U.S. citizen that will stand your way is unpaid loans that are tied to the government already, like maybe a student loan and that sort of thing. So you have to get that fixed. You can fix it, but look for it. But I look for SBA pre-qualified businesses as being the very, very best. Look, I could ramble on and on and on. I love what I do. I get excited, and I want people like yourself that are looking at this to make sure that you're making great ideas and great decisions. You can reach out to us anytime. I always say, why start up when you can start start up. And that's my example of start up, making money, etc., versus starting from scratch, because it can take sometimes months, sometimes years. I've talked to companies that 5 or 6 years into their operation, even with franchises, that have been losing money. So when you buy an existing business, you've got the advantage of making things work initially. And that doesn't mean you don't have any risk whatsoever, so you have to be cautious. And that's the reason I provide classes like this and seminars, and include even a business buyer training class we've got, which you're welcome to join us anytime you want. Here's my contact information. Brian Stevens, Legacy Venture Group. When you sell a business, you share a legacy. When you buy a business, you begin a dream. Make sure that the dream is a real dream and doesn't turn into a nightmare by doing your research, being prepared. Whether you're anywhere in the country, we can be glad to chat with you and help you if you would like some help out there, or just be prepared and find the right people around you, make great decisions, and make your dreams happen. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.